Hi everyone, in this video we're going to be talking about improving science lesson plans with the 3D learning framework. One thing that could really help you out in this particular video is if you follow this link. This is a bit.ly link and it is case sensitive, but if you follow this link it will take you to a document that includes the SEPs, which we'll discuss what those are, and the CCCs, which will be helpful for our discussion later. So if you're able to, you can click on this link, pull up that document, and you'll have that available to you as we go through this. So the first thing that we're going to talk about here is what is the 3D learning framework. This is something that, like the name suggests, has 3 dimensions. And it's kind of conceptualized here. You can see in this graphic the 3 different dimensions of the 3D learning framework. So this is K-12 science learning. It's specific to science in 3 dimensions. And those 3 dimensions are disciplinary core ideas, which are over here. We see those oftentimes in orange. The science and engineering practices, which we call SCPs. Those are oftentimes visualized in kind of this purple color. And then cross-cutting concepts, which are often shown in green. Now what we're going to do in this video just very briefly is go through each one of these dimensions so you have an idea of how the standards work and how the framework works when we put together lesson plans or we evaluate lesson plans for these different dimensions. So just starting out with disciplinary core ideas, or DCIs as I will oftentimes refer to them, these are kind of close to earlier generation content standards or standards that you might be familiar with from other disciplines. They look a lot like previous ones. You can see here's one, a physical science elementary one for forces in motion, talking about pushes and pulls. And you can see that it does read in a way that connects to a scientific concept directly. In contrast to kind of previous generation science standards, the disciplinary core ideas are really focused on big ideas, things that are important to science concepts. So you're not going to find things that are super granular and specific, like, tell me the 3 different types of rocks that you would find in the rock cycle. You won't find things like that. They're more kind of big idea standards in these DCIs. And the other thing that's kind of taken under consideration for these DCIs is that they build them in such a way that if you have a DCI, it should be foundational to learning something at a higher level. So there are kind of these strings, vertical strings that start out at the elementary level and they go kind of up through high school in ways that kind of build on one another, building blocks of these DCIs. And here's kind of a mid elementary example, probably 4th grade life science. And it looks at kind of the very early parts of an evolution discussion and talking about natural selection. So that's the DCI. That's probably what we're most familiar with from any kind of previous experience we've had with standards. Then what 3D learning framework does is actually add to that. And one of the things that it adds are the science and engineering practices. And these tend to be performance-based. They're things like what can you actually do with science, not just what do you know about a specific topic, but what can you actually do with that science. And by setting them up to be performance-based, they kind of promote active learning because it's hard to achieve these standards and these SEPs without, well, really what we call the 4 C's of 21st century learning. You may have some experience with these, but they're good to keep in mind. That of critical thinking, collaboration, creativity, and communication. And so here I have listed the SEPs, or science and engineering practices, that we're looking for whenever we are exploring those DCIs. Whenever we're exploring the content, we want to try to build experiences for our students that allow them to practice these science and engineering practices. And you can see here asking questions, defining problems, developing and using models, planning and carrying out investigations, analyzing and interpreting data, using math and computational thinking, constructing explanations and design solutions, engaging in argument from evidence, that kind of gets at the communication piece, and obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information. So many of, or hopefully all of the learning activities that a teacher or curriculum designer would generate in the 3D learning framework would really focus in on it, one, maybe two of these as kind of a point of focus. And then finally, the third dimension of the 3D learning framework is cross-cutting concepts. And these are a little bit harder to maybe wrap your mind around, but the idea behind them is that these are concepts that transcend science. So they're important for not just one science concept, but they keep on recurring in lots of different science concepts. And sometimes you can find them across the different STEM disciplines, so technology, engineering, math, oftentimes. And they do form these connections to other subjects, even outside of the STEM disciplines. So I have here listed also, and you may have these if you pulled up that link that I gave you initially, the idea of patterns, the idea of cause and effect, scale, proportion, quantity, systems and system models, energy and matter flows, cycles and conservation, structure and function, and stability and change. Those are our CCCs. Now, oftentimes you won't actually design your lesson around the cross-cutting concepts. These are things that end up kind of popping up, I would say, when you generate good science lessons that involve the DCIs and the SEPs, the science and engineering practices. We tend to find these, and so it's more not about necessarily using these or building your lesson around these CCCs, but instead highlighting them when they come up. Highlighting them. And then talking about connections to other things. Because students oftentimes want to put everything in a silo. Hey, this is science class, this isn't math class. Or hey, this is science class, this isn't reading class, or whatever it might be. And what we want to show them, kind of using these cross-cutting concepts, or at least thinking about them, is that everything here is connected. And we see kind of these recurring themes across disciplines. So that's the idea of the CCCs. So if we put it all together, and you read the next generation science standards, what you will see are pages that look like this, and it's a little bit daunting, but we can break it down. So up top, you're going to find kind of the unified performance expectations to demonstrate understanding. And these are written in such a way that they actively combine our science and engineering practices, disciplinary core ideas, and these cross-cutting concepts, and they bring them all together. But we can break them back out and look and see that for this one, mathematics and computational thinking is the science and engineering practice that we're going to be working on. The disciplinary core ideas are about conservation of mass, generally speaking. And in terms of cross-cutting concepts, we're talking about scale, proportion, and quantity, which very much go with chemical reactions and chemical formulae. Then down below, you can find other things that are connections with the Common Core, you can see here. So many states use the Common Core or a version thereof for their English language arts. And then, of course, we have mathematics down here as well that show how the science standards written up as these next generation science standards, which utilize the 3D learning framework. You can see where they've drawn connections from their own standard to other standards that are kind of relevant. So there's a real question, and it's a fair one. Well, where does this 3D science learning framework come from? So the next generation science standards, and you can see here, this is based on 3D science learning. They were published in 2012, and they come from the National Research Council that basically brought a ton of people together, from professors to secondary teachers, primary school teachers, policymakers, other stakeholders. They all came together and they published the Next Generation Science Standards in 2012. Utilized research, utilized opinions from all over the place, came up with these standards. Fast forward to 2022, a decade later, 44 states, give or take, were using the next generation science standards either completely, adopted it wholesale. That's what we see here in blue. They either adopted it completely and are using it directly, or like many Midwest states here, they have chosen to use the standards to write their own, basically using it as a framework. So it's extraordinarily widespread, and it's something that you're going to see pretty much wherever you teach, unless you're going to Pennsylvania or Texas or Florida or something like that. So the 3D learning framework is something that is, deeply embedded, at least from a policy perspective, in U.S. science education at this point. So the question becomes, why was everybody so eager to change? Why are 44 states using this when before they, obviously had their own standards that they had prior to 2012? The old paradigm with standards, or the old plan, or the kind of way that standards worked, was that they really did focus on discrete facts. What's the hardness of granite? Or, what are the 3 different types of volcanoes? Or what are the parts of a cell? Very discrete facts, and they were testing these things. But the problem with that kind of focus on discrete facts only, or majority of the time just worried about discrete facts, is that it kind of incentivizes a content march, is what I call it, where you basically have to cover everything, and you're under this pressure to get through everything, and you have to go fast because there are so many different discrete facts that you have to cover in a semester or in a school year. And as a result of that, you as a teacher, if you're in that system, you need to come up with a very efficient way to cover everything. And what we find is that the most efficient way to deliver content is basically through lecture. Lecture, even to younger kids, right? If you have to cover a lot of discrete facts, you are not really given as much of a choice, and you end up having to present, through direct instruction, most of your science content. That is not seen as the best way to do it by more recent research, and it explains partially why we have this adoption of these newer standards and kind of this new paradigm. And so the old paradigm was basically a mile wide and an inch deep. And the idea there is that everything under the sun in science is really covered superficially. Yes, we technically covered everything, but how much do we really know about each thing that we covered? How much do our students really know about each thing we covered? The idea is very little, unfortunately. So we have this new paradigm. What if we took and kind of brought down the number of discrete facts that are necessary, focused on big science ideas, and then brought in these performance-based skills that really promote scientific thinking? Because if we can get students to think scientifically and to kind of hone those skills, then those discrete facts become much easier to learn when they have all of these kind of things at their fingertips anyway through Google and what have you. So the idea behind these next generation science standards and the 3D learning framework is to really bring in the performance-based standards. And you can see here I have the SEPs all listed there again. And then another big thing is connections. How do we connect from science to other things? Because in the real world, science doesn't exist by itself. It's connected to math, it's connected to sociology, it's connected to so many other things. And so when we kind of narrow down the number of actual discrete facts that students need to know, focus on big ideas, focus on these performance-based measures of science and engineering practice, we get a system that all of a sudden is more about student-centered learning. It's more about getting students to do things, because it's hard to be true to these standards and make these happen if you are having students constantly just sit in chairs and listen to the teacher talk. To that end, there are certain activities that support the kind of aims of the science and engineering practices and cross-cutting concepts, and these tend to be aligned with student-centered learning. Things like inquiry, where you're doing experiments or investigations where you don't know the outcome ahead of time. Or project or problem-based learning, where you take real-world problems that involve more than just science, but also involve society. They involve math. They might involve reading and persuasive speech and those things, and you kind of tackle those all together. Or engineering activities, where you are trying to optimize a design solution to solve a problem. All of those are things that in a system that values these science and engineering practices and the connections between different disciplines, they happen more often, and they're good for students because they promote kind of those 4 C's we were talking about before, among which are critical thinking, collaboration, creativity, and communication. Again, something to keep in mind. All right, so how do we align activities with a 3D science learning framework? There's really 2 lanes or 2 directions you can go with this. One is to generate new lessons, wholesale, from just starting with an idea and actually building a lesson. Or we can modify existing lessons. So I'm going to go through each one separately and kind of talk about the pros and cons of each approach. So when we look here at generating new science lessons, really the first step is to pick a DCI. So we pick a DCI, one of these disciplinary core ideas. And here I use the one for natural selection, the idea that certain individuals within a species are better adapted than others, and as a result, over time, they might survive and reproduce better, and so you see some change in an average within your population over time due to selective pressures. And then from your DCI, you think about, okay, what can I do from those SEPs, science engineering practices, that will help me generate an activity that will kind of bring this DCI home for my students. And so for me, when I was designing a lesson based on this, for me, I thought developing and using models would be a great way to demo this. And then also analyzing and interpreting data as a secondary. And so what I did is I created this game for my students to do. And I've run this with middle school students and high school students, obviously tweaking for different levels. So I developed this scenario where we have predatory cats. This happens to be an ocelot, but it's a hypothetical cat in my lesson. And turtles. This is a snapping turtle, but I just use a kind of a generic hypothetical turtle. And we use dice and probability. I have turtles of differing weight. And the heavy turtles are harder to turn over for the cats. So in order for a cat to have a successful kind of attack on a heavier turtle, they have to roll just maybe like a 6. They have to roll 6, otherwise the turtle survives. If you're a lighter turtle, maybe the person who's playing the part of the cat only has to roll a 3 or higher, and if they do, then they have a successful attack and they kill that lighter turtle. And we run this in the entire classroom, and as you can imagine, just based on probability, what you tend to see after a couple of rounds of this game is that you're almost only the turtles that are left are almost exclusively those heavy turtles after a couple of rounds. And what that does is essentially show this to be true, that you start out with turtles where you have individuals with certain characteristics. They're not all exactly the same. In this case, we're talking about weight differs among them, and we find out that weight being heavier is an advantage over time, and we end up with a population that has more heavy turtles, and we figure that out through analyzing the data. So what we are able to look at then is the fact that we have a cause and effect relationship. The turtles that are heavier tend to survive better, therefore reproduce better, and they end up kind of becoming the norm in the population as time goes on because they're under this kind of predatory pressure from the cats. And so what I do with this then, after we go through this kind of hypothetical scenario, is that I bring a real world example of garter snakes and rough-skinned newts. Now these newts are really good at producing toxins, really nasty toxins that are many times more toxic, use my skull and crossbones, many times more toxic than say cyanide. And the question is, why do they have to be so poisonous? They don't use their poison to kill any sort of prey or anything like that. What they find out is that garter snakes love to eat these newts, and that garter snakes, in response to the fact that many of these rough-skinned newts were becoming more toxic, they were developing resistance to the toxin. And so what we call this is an arms race, an evolutionary arms race. Because as time goes on, the newts that are the most nasty in terms of their poison, they increase in the population. And if you're a snake that eats these rough-skinned newts and it's a big part of your diet, the only ones that are left after a while are the snakes that have the greatest resistance to this toxin. And so over time, the newts become more toxic and the snakes become more resistant to that toxin. And that's a way that we can drive home this kind of cause and effect cross-cutting concept with a real world example. So that's an example of generating a new lesson that uses this. Basically, number one, you start with the DCI. Two, you look for SEPs that fit your purposes, kind of develop the activity. And three, then you look for kind of those CCCs that you can highlight and connect to other things. There are some drawbacks to generating these new lessons. One of them is that they require a considerable amount of science conceptual knowledge. That it's hard to walk in and really have not a great grip on maybe a higher level science concept and then try to develop one of these 3D science lessons. So that's one thing. Another thing is that there is a lot of planning time required. I developed that lesson that I just kind of profiled for you over 2 or 3 semesters, and one of the things was like as a project, like a lesson improvement project through the district that I actually got a little extra time to work on. So it takes a lot of time to develop new lessons, but they can be very powerful when you do. What's far more likely, and what I would advocate for 9 times out of 10, maybe more, is to look at modifying existing lessons. Take a look at what you already have and figure out how you can make it better or better align it to the 3D science learning. And so most lessons that you start out with are going to have something related to some DCI. Now, in the document that I had linked to that bit link at the beginning of the video, you can click on the very top link there and actually search the NGSS standards for a DCI based on keyword, based on grade, and things like that. So that would be a great way to find out what a learning objective kind of might connect to your DCI. So then what I would do next is, once you kind of know what the DCI is that your existing lesson plan is getting at, then I would say, after you've read through the lesson plan, you know the lesson plan, then you want to explore that list of SEPs and just like pick one way that you could build an activity that exists kind of in that same lesson, but uses, one of those science and engineering practices. And then in terms of the CCCs, these oftentimes are, again, just things to highlight, things that kind of naturally slot in and fit with what you're already designing. So the amount of like active work that needs to be done here differs based on your goals, but oftentimes you can find a good math connection in the CCCs. So something to keep in mind. And so here's an example of a modification that I've done to a lesson that I was able to find online, because there's a lot of ones online that on the face of them, they look like disasters and there's like no way that a lesson can be rehabilitated, but you find just a couple tweaks can actually make it a pretty strong lesson. So I found one online, a fourth grade science lesson plan where students take notes on the parts of the plant based on direct instruction, so lecture, and then use scissors to cut apart a flower to see and identify the parts inside. So right now, we're not really doing 3D science. It's hands-on and they are kind of observing things, but we haven't really gotten into a place where we are doing any scientific thinking, which is a goal. We want to get to scientific thinking, okay? And the SEPs support that. So we are going to identify the DCI. I went through and I did that. Of course, I got to erase this in order for us to be able to see what we want to see. That reproduction is essential to the continued existence of every kind of organism. Plants and animals have unique and diverse life cycles. And of course, we all know that flowers are the reproductive kind of part of the plant, at least flowering plants. And so that's kind of where we're going with this. They're going to pick one SEP. I thought for this, because it's kind of an intro lesson, because in the original version they take notes on the parts of the plant, I thought that asking questions would be a really good SEP to explore for this lesson. And I identified the CCC of structure and function. And this is just the idea that things that are built a certain way tend to have a function that kind of corresponds to their structure, and flowers are no exception to this. And so in my modified version, what I changed it to, I didn't really change that much, just that students dissect a flower, they're still using those scissors, without previous instructions, so we haven't taken notes yet. And they, instead of kind of trying to connect it to notes they've already taken, their job is to write questions, just like it says in this SEP right here, write questions that they would need to answer to understand what flowers do, or know what flowers do for a plant and how they work. And so now we're thinking scientifically, like what would I need to know in order to really understand this whole flower business? Because I've seen flowers a million times, but I really don't know exactly what they do or how they work. And so that could be a lead-in then to another lesson where they're provided with some resources that they can explore to kind of answer some of their questions, or they might be answered in a future direct instruction kind of event. So it can be that simple. It doesn't have to be super complicated in the modification way. That's a huge pro of doing modification. It takes far less time. And if you do it in a structured way, it doesn't have to take a ton of hard thinking in order to get a lesson from really no good scientific thinking or very little scientific thinking to the type of scientific thinking that we want to promote in our classrooms in all of our 3D science lessons. So this has been an intro to the idea of the 3D science learning framework with some how-tos for how to change lessons, how to generate new lessons in that framework, and then also just a couple examples for both generating new and modifying existing lessons.